I first started working on the New York desk, which was the second half of 2004, there were many of the larger orchestras that were going into contract negotiation. We had Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Cleveland, National Symphony, and I'm sure I've forgotten a couple, but certainly that group sticks in my mind. And there was palpable pressure from the management side in the wake of all of the struggles with 9/11 and with the stock market taking a big piece out of these endowment funds. There was a real desire to, in a unified way, bring those wages down as a group. Those orchestras did pull together and talked among themselves and talked across the table, and as a result of that, there was not a single strike out of that entire group of highly contentious, difficult
And the Philadelphia situation got quite ugly, with a lot of name-calling in public and the taking out of ads in the newspapers.
Oh, and the website, and
yes.
There was all kinds of stuff going on. And I'm not going to say that there was not acrimony or that they were not difficult negotiations. They were very difficult.
I'm just underlining what you said. In spite of a lot of acrimony, there were no strikes.
Yes. And I think that you have to say, at the end of the day, that there was a shared understanding that it was going to be important to preserve that level of compensation and working conditions for those musicians in order to preserve these institutions.
Ultimately, we sink or swim together.
That's right. But in that context, having set the scene, we then had the St. Louis Agreement, which, for reasons that escape me, expired mid-season. They must have done some sort of a adjustment of the fiscal year or something. So it expired after those negotiations had settled. And there was no reason for it to end in anything other than a really positive outcome for all concerned. And that's what fascinated me about that particular dispute. Because you had an individual at the helm, Randy Adams, who's a very successful businessman and who had come in to rebuild this institution. And you have to say that he did a magnificent job of doing that. What he was able to achieve in terms of building relationships and availing himself of his connections in the community and promoting that wonderful institution, he raised in excess of $130 million for the endowment fund. It was astounding. And this was after they had gotten through some very difficult times. The musicians had really made some huge sacrifices at the bargaining table in terms of their compensation. And this is an orchestra that has a reputation for playing beautifully.
Yeah,
everything I've ever read has been rave reviews.
Well, I've heard them, and they do play beautifully.
I'm sure they do. But as significant as the pay cuts that were taken in good faith and peacefully was the fact that the institution had embarked on a project of collaboration where they really were trying to do things in a new way, a meaningful way, where they would see the fate of the institution jointly. To then have a situation where Mr. Adams had been so successful in the fundraising arena, I believe that the problem was, actually it was a positive and a negative at the same time. There was a vision that he had, a blueprint for the future of the organization, and there were dollars and goals attached to that blueprint, and he was very much on track. The problem was where they were at that point in time. He was not yet ready to pull monies out of the endowment into operations in order to support the kinds of wage increases the musicians wanted.
That management maintained that certain money that the orchestra had was earmarked for the endowment by the donors and was needed for the endowment, which admittedly is lower than the endowments of comparable orchestras, and that, rightly or wrongly, management refused to budge on that question.
That's right. And in my opinion, that was a relationship failure where he had had so much relationship success in the business community with the fundraising. I think he failed to recognize that it was also very important for him to preserve that relationship and that trust that had been built with the musicians. And they felt betrayed. And it was very sad. And they felt that they had no choice but to go out on that strike. I don't know that there were any winners to that particular job dispute. I think they came out of it the best they could. Everything I have seen since then shows me that all parties involved are trying very hard to rebuild.
They really are. I know some of the parties involved here, including Randy, and without going into any detail, it's just clear to me that people on both sides were shattered to some extent by this, just emotionally devastated. And in part, it's not just that it's an ugly thing whenever it happens, but there had been such trust before that it broke down. But they are trying to rebuild. I'm curious to know what the AFFM's role is in something like this.
In that particular dispute, our role was a supporting one, which corresponds to the role of the Federation in supporting locals in this work.
Because the local is responsible for the negotiations.
That's
so
right.
It's in their hands, not yours.
But we had some wonderful ties. The ICSOM, which is the representative group of the symphony musicians, has a chair who plays piccolo in the St. Louis Symphony, and he and I, of course, are in contact all the time, Jan Gippo. And their attorney, their negotiating attorney, Len Leibowitz, is on retainer with the Symphonic Services Division. So we had all of these wonderful connections already. And I chose to provide support by writing articles in the International Musician.
Which is the publication of the AFFM.
That's right, it's our official journal. And early on in the dispute, I wrote a rave review about Randy Adams and his achievements in hopes that that would somehow lead them to understand that they had achieved so much and to invite him to move that extra step to resolve this dispute. Later on, I wrote one that was a little bit more harsh.
Which you have every right to do. What strikes me talking to you here is that you are, on one hand, a sort of statesman or stateswoman of the orchestra world, in that you really think, as everybody in this business has to now, about what the long-range interest of orchestras has to be. But on the other hand, and quite rightly, your job is, as representative of the musicians, to support the musicians' interest, which is something that can't be forgotten. No amount of cooperative work changes the fact that you have different parties at the table who have their own way of looking at things and their own interests. And if the musicians do not look out for their own interests, nobody will.
I believe that's true. I think that the future lies, though, in all parties involved keeping three things in front of them. We have to have wonderful music. That's what it's all about, first and foremost. We have to have healthy institutions to employ our members, because if we don't have that, we won't get number three, which is good jobs for our members, and that's what we're all about. And by good jobs, I mean adequate compensation commensurate with their training and with working conditions that keep them safe and healthy and able to live full lives.
And that last is actually an interesting point, because we forget sometimes that being a symphonic musician is not the easiest thing in the world. There can be repetitive strain injuries. There can be hearing loss. What does the union do?
Well, the injuries, that's an interesting piece. I'll come back to that. But there is another thing I think is very important that not everyone's aware of, and that is that there are really two kinds of full-time symphonic performance careers. The one kind we all are familiar with, which is the full-time job in the full-time orchestra. And the other kind is what we call the driving for dollars career, where musicians will play in